I'm going to tell you about a plant that my great-grandfather grew right here on this land. A plant that could pull nitrogen straight out of the air and fix it into the soil without a single bag of fertilizer, without a single dollar spent at the feed store. They banned it, not in some far-off country, not in some ancient time. Right here in America, in my lifetime, I watched them make it illegal to plant something that had fed my family through the Depression. This plant breaks every rule that modern agriculture runs on. It doesn't need what they're selling. It makes its own nitrogen, the same nitrogen that farmers spend billions on every single year, the same nitrogen that runs off into rivers and creates dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. This plant just reaches up into the air, grabs that nitrogen, and puts it in the ground for free. My grandfather used to walk me through the back 40 and point to the black locust trees along the fence line. "Billy Joe," he'd say, "those trees are working right now. They're making the soil rich while we're standing here talking." He wasn't speaking poetry. He was speaking science that his grandfather taught him, science that goes back thousands of years, science that worked before the chemical companies convinced us we needed their products to grow food. I remember the fields in the 1970s. We had autumn olive shrubs mixed right in with the crops. The old-timers called them nitrogen nurses. They'd plant them in degraded soil, soil that had been worn out by cotton or tobacco, and within 5 years that ground would be black and rich again. I saw it with my own eyes. My uncle had 40 acres that wouldn't grow anything but weeds. He planted nitrogen-fixing shrubs and trees in rows, let them work for 3 seasons, then cut them back and planted corn. That corn grew 8 feet tall without a single application of synthetic fertilizer. Then the 1980s came. The USDA started putting out bulletins. These plants were suddenly invasive. They were aggressive. They were noxious weeds. The same plants that had fed us, that had rebuilt our soil, that had kept this farm alive when we couldn't afford chemicals, were now illegal to propagate in most states. I watched extension agents tell my neighbors to cut down the black locust groves their grandfathers had planted. I watched them spray herbicide on autumn olive that had been feeding wildlife and fixing nitrogen for 50 years. Nobody explained why these plants suddenly became dangerous. Nobody showed us evidence that they were causing harm. They just told us to get rid of them and buy fertilizer instead. 47 states now restrict or ban various nitrogen-fixing plants. Not because they don't work, because they work too well. Because they work without requiring you to purchase anything, without making you dependent on supply chains, without tying you to corporations that profit from your need. This is a story about a plant, yes, but it's really a story about control. It's about what happens when something in nature provides for free what industry wants to sell. It's about knowledge that gets erased not because it's false, but because it's threatening. My family has been on this land for 5 generations, and we've watched them systematically remove every plant that offered independence, every technique that didn't require purchased inputs, every piece of wisdom that suggested you could feed yourself without their permission. The plant I'm talking about is still here. It's still fixing nitrogen. It's just illegal now in most places to deliberately grow it. My great-grandpa's people knew these plants by different names. The Cherokee called the black locust Tsiyugansite, which meant something close to the tree that heals the ground. They weren't being poetic. They were being precise. They understood what modern science took until the 1880s to figure out, that certain plants form partnerships with bacteria in their roots, pulling nitrogen from the air and converting it into a form that feeds everything around them. The old folks passed down stories about planting corn and beans together, about how the beans would climb the corn stalks and make the soil better for next year's crop. They didn't know the word rhizobia. They didn't need to. They knew that beans left something in the ground that corn needed, and they built entire agricultural systems around that knowledge. The Three Sisters planting method, corn, beans, and squash together, wasn't just tradition. It was sophisticated nitrogen management that worked for thousands of years before the first bag of synthetic fertilizer ever got manufactured. When the first European settlers came through here in the 1700s, they wrote about it. William Bartram traveled through the southeast in 1773 and documented native fields where crops grew thick and healthy year after year, without the soil depleting. He couldn't figure it out. European agriculture at that time required letting fields go fallow, required rotation, required constant inputs of manure. But here were people growing abundant crops on the same ground season after season. The secret was the nitrogen fixers planted right alongside everything else. My great-great-grandfather, who was born in 1867, learned from people who still remember those techniques. He told my great-grandfather about planting black locust in rows through the fields, about using honey locust and Kentucky coffee tree as living fences that fed the soil while they marked boundaries. These weren't ornamental choices. Every plant had a job, and the nitrogen fixers were the foundation of the whole system. The science caught up eventually. In 1888, two German scientists named Hellriegel and Wilfarth proved that legumes form symbiotic relationships with soil bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into amable compounds. They published papers showing that a single acre of healthy legumes could fix between 100 and 300 pounds of nitrogen per year. That's nitrogen you don't have to buy, nitrogen that doesn't require natural gas to manufacture, nitrogen that doesn't run off into waterways and create algae blooms. But my people already knew. They'd been watching it work for generations. My great-grandfather showed me the root nodules on clover plants when I was 6 years old. See those little bumps, Billy Joe? That's where the magic happens. That's where the plant is grabbing nitrogen right out of the air and turning it into food for the soil. He pulled up a bean plant and showed me the same thing. Every bean you plant is making the ground better. Every single one. The agricultural colleges started teaching this in the early 1900s. Extension bulletins from the 1920s and 1930s recommended planting nitrogen-fixing trees and shrubs on every farm. The USDA published guides on using black locust for soil improvement, on interplanting clover with crops, on managing autumn olive for both nitrogen fixation and wildlife food. This wasn't fringe knowledge. This was mainstream agricultural science recommended by the same government agencies that would later classify these plants as invasive species. I still have some of those old bulletins in the barn. They're falling apart now, pages yellow and brittle, but the information is still true. The plants still work the same way they always did. The bacteria still fix nitrogen. The soil still gets richer. Nothing about the biology changed. Only the politics did. I saw the fields myself, walked through them as a boy in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when my grandfather still managed this farm the way his father taught him. We had black locust planted in alleys between the crop rows, 30 feet apart, running north to south so they wouldn't shade out the vegetables. Every spring those trees would leaf out and start working, their roots going deep, those nitrogen-fixing nodules pumping nutrients into the soil that our tomatoes and corn would use all summer long. My grandfather didn't guess at this. He measured it. He kept notebooks, brown leather-bound books that I still have in the house, where he recorded everything. In 1972, he sent soil samples to the Extension office in April before planting in again in October after harvest. The fields with black locust alleys showed nitrogen increases of 180 pounds per acre without a single application of fertilizer. The control fields where he'd removed the trees 5 years earlier to try modern methods required 200 pounds of synthetic nitrogen per acre just to produce the same yield. He showed me those numbers when I was 12 years old. You see this, Billy Joe? Those trees are making us money while they grow. They're doing work we'd have to pay for otherwise. He calculated that each mature black locust was worth about $40 per year in nitrogen alone, not counting the firewood, the fence posts, the honey from the flowers. We had 200 trees in the alleys. That was $8,000 of nitrogen production every single year, and the trees just kept doing it. The USDA knew these numbers. They published them. A 1965 study from the Soil Conservation Service measured autumn olive nitrogen fixation at 220 pounds per acre annually. Russian olive, which grew along every creek on our property, fixed 160 pounds per acre. Even the little clover plants that grew between crop rows were contributing 100 to 150 pounds per acre. My grandfather kept all these studies in a file cabinet. He treated them like treasure because they proved what he was seeing with his own eyes. I remember the summer of 1976. We had a drought, the worst one in 40 years. Our neighbors' fields turned brown by July. They'd been using synthetic fertilizer for a decade by then, and when the rain stopped, their crops just gave up. Our fields stayed green into August. My grandfather walked me through the rows and dug down with a spade to show me why. The black locust roots went down 15 feet, bringing up water, and everywhere those roots reached, the soil was dark and held moisture like a sponge. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria had created soil structure that synthetic fertilizer never could. We weren't the only ones doing this. Every old farm in this county had nitrogen-fixing trees somewhere on the property. The Hendersons had honey locust along their driveway. The Pratts had Siberian pea shrub in their windbreaks. The Johnsons planted autumn olive on every eroded hillside they owned, and within 10 years those hillsides were producing hay again. This was common knowledge, common practice, the way farming worked when you didn't have money to waste on inputs. Then the extension agents started coming around in the late 1970s with new information. Those plants we'd been using were actually problems. They were invasive, they said. They would take over if we didn't control them. They had new products we should be using instead, new fertilizers with better formulations, more efficient delivery systems. My grandfather listened politely and kept farming the way he always had. He'd seen trends come and go. He trusted what worked, and the nitrogen fixers worked. The Second World War proved what these plants could do when everything else failed. My grandmother talked about this until the day she died, how the Victory Gardens kept families alive when the men were overseas and the factories were making bullets instead of fertilizer. Every pound of ammonium nitrate that could have fed crops went into explosives. The government told people to grow their own food, but they didn't tell them how to do it without fertilizer. The old folks already knew. My grandmother planted beans between every row of corn in 1943. She planted clover as ground cover in the pathways. She had my grandfather, who was too young for the draft, plant black locust saplings around the entire garden plot before he left for the factory work. By 1944, that garden was producing enough vegetables to feed 8 children, plus 3 neighbor families whose men were fighting in Europe. She canned 400 quarts that summer. I've seen the photographs, rows and rows of mason jars in the cellar, and behind them you can see the black locust trees, already 4 feet tall, already working. The USDA published bulletins during the war that they'd never publish today. Bulletin 1468, Nitrogen-Fixing Plants for Victory Gardens, came out in 1943 and recommended planting legumes with every crop, using black locust and honey locust as living fences, and establishing autumn olive on any unused ground. They weren't suggesting this as an option. They were instructing people to do it because synthetic nitrogen wasn't available and wouldn't be available until the war ended. 20 million American families planted victory gardens, and the ones that succeeded were the ones that remembered how to work with nitrogen-fixing plants. My uncle served in Italy and came back in 1946 with stories about farmers there who'd been using these techniques for centuries. He saw fields where olive trees and carob trees grew among the grain crops, fixing nitrogen, providing shade, creating microclimates that protected everything around them. Those Italian farmers looked at American agriculture like we were crazy, he said. Why would you pay for something the plants will give you for free? Why would you create dependency when you could create partnership? But the war changed everything about farming. The same factories that had been making explosives needed a product to manufacture when peace came. Ammonium nitrate works as fertilizer the same way it works as a bomb. It's concentrated nitrogen in a form that releases fast. The Haber-Bosch process, invented in 1909 to make explosives, became the foundation of post-war agriculture. Suddenly, nitrogen wasn't something you grew. It was something you bought. My grandmother watched this transition happen in real time. In 1945, nobody in this county used synthetic fertilizer. By 1950, the feed stores were selling it, and the extension agents were recommending it, and the farm magazines were advertising it on every page. She kept growing her beans and clover, kept maintaining those black locust trees, but her neighbors started switching over. The fertilizer salesman promised bigger yields, faster growth, less work. They didn't mention the cost, the dependency, the soil degradation that would show up 10 years later. I asked her once why she never switched, why she kept doing things the old way when everyone else was modernizing. She looked at me like I'd asked why she kept breathing. Billy Joe, those plants fed us through the Depression and through the war. They never asked for anything but space to grow. Why would I abandon something that loyal? She died in 1989, still planting beans in her garden, still trusting the partnership between plants and soil that had sustained her family through the hardest years America ever faced. In 1947, the first commercial synthetic nitrogen fertilizer plants opened across America, converting weapons factories into agricultural supply chains. The companies had a problem, though. Farmers like my grandfather weren't buying. Why would they? They had systems that worked, systems that cost nothing, systems that improved the soil instead of depleting it. So the companies did what industries always do when people don't need their product. They created the need. The marketing started small. Magazine advertisements showing side-by-side comparisons of crops grown with and without synthetic fertilizer. The fertilized side always looked bigger, greener, more abundant. What they didn't show was that those comparison fields had been deliberately depleted first, or that the synthetic nitrogen gave a quick boost that wouldn't last, or that the unfertilized side could have been growing nitrogen fixers that would have produced the same results for free. My grandfather kept those magazines. He'd mark them up with a pencil, writing notes in the margins about what they weren't telling you. By 1950, the extension agents were fully on board. They came to farm meetings with charts and presentations showing how modern agriculture required modern inputs. They talked about efficiency and yield maximization and economies of scale. They made farming sound like factory work where every input could be calculated and controlled. The old methods, they said, were unpredictable. Nitrogen-fixing plants took time to establish. They required knowledge. They didn't deliver nitrogen on a predictable schedule. Better to just buy what you need when you need it. My father watched the neighbors start converting in the 1950s. The Hendersons cut down their honey locust trees because they were told the trees competed with crops for water. The Pratts ripped out their Siberian pea shrub windbreaks because modern farms needed bigger fields for bigger equipment. The Johnsons sprayed their autumn olive hillsides with herbicide because the extension agent said those plants were aggressive and would spread. Within 5 years, all 3 families were spending thousands of dollars annually on fertilizer. Within 10 years, their soil was gray and compacted and required even more inputs to produce anything. The science that had supported nitrogen-fixing plants didn't disappear. It just stopped being published in places farmers would see it. The agricultural colleges still taught the biology. Researchers still studied rhizobia bacteria and nitrogen fixation rates. But the extension bulletins changed. The ones from the 1930s and 1940s that recommended black locust and autumn olive got replaced with bulletins about fertilizer application rates and timing. The knowledge didn't become false. It just became inconvenient. By 1960, American farmers were spending $2 billion annually on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. By 1980, that number was $12 billion. Today, it's over $150 billion globally. That's $150 billion flowing to chemical companies every single year for something that plants will provide for free if you let them. My grandfather used to calculate what that meant. "Billy Joe," he'd say, "every farmer buying fertilizer is paying for the privilege of doing worse than nature does on its own. They're paying to create problems they'll have to pay more to solve later." He wasn't wrong. The synthetic nitrogen runs off into waterways and creates dead zones. It requires natural gas to manufacture, making agriculture dependent on fossil fuels. It kills soil biology, including the very bacteria that fix nitrogen naturally. It's a perfect product from a business perspective. It creates the conditions that make itself necessary. Use it once, and you'll need it forever because you've destroyed the natural systems that would have done the job for free. My grandfather never bought a bag of synthetic nitrogen in his life. He died in 1985 with soil richer than when he was born. I watched it happen in the 1980s, watched them turn useful plants into criminals. The same autumn olive that my grandfather planted to heal eroded hillsides, the same black locust that had been recommended by the USDA for 50 years, the same Russian olive that grew along every creek and fixed nitrogen while stabilizing banks. Suddenly they were invasive species. Suddenly they were threats. Suddenly they were illegal to sell, illegal to plant, and in some states illegal to even possess. The reclassification happened fast. In 1985, autumn olive was still listed as a recommended conservation plant in our state. By 1987, it was on the noxious weed list. Nobody asked the farmers who'd been using it successfully for decades. Nobody conducted studies on our properties to see if it was actually causing problems. They just declared it invasive and told us to get rid of it. I remember the meeting at the extension office where they announced this. My father stood up and asked what had changed. The agent couldn't give him a straight answer. "New research," he said, "better understanding of ecological impacts." But I read that research. I drove to the university library and looked up every study they cited. Most of it was about autumn olive spreading in natural areas, in parks and preserves, where nobody was managing it. None of it was about agricultural settings where farmers were actively using these plants as tools. None of it addressed the fact that these plants only spread aggressively in disturbed soil, and that healthy, well-managed land didn't have problems with them. The research was real, but it was being applied in ways that didn't match what it actually showed. Black locust got hit the same way. By 1990, it was restricted or banned in 47 states. The tree that built the Navy's ships in the 1800s because its wood doesn't rot, the tree that fed my family through the Depression, the tree that fixes 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre while growing the most rot-resistant lumber in North America, suddenly it was a problem that needed to be controlled. The justification was that it spreads through root suckers and forms thickets. My grandfather had managed that trait for 40 years by simply cutting the suckers once a year. It took him an afternoon. Russian olive, autumn olive, black locust, honey locust, Siberian pea shrub, one by one they all got classified as invasive. Some states included Elaeagnus species, which covered several nitrogen-fixing shrubs that had been used in conservation plantings since the 1930s. The Soil Conservation Service had literally given these plants away for free to farmers for erosion control, and now those same farmers were being told they had to eradicate them or face fines. I watched my neighbors comply. The Johnsons paid a contractor $15,000 to clear the autumn olive from their hillsides. Within 2 years, those hillsides were eroding again, gullies cutting through what had been stable ground. They had to spend another $10,000 on synthetic erosion control measures and fertilizer to try to establish grass. The autumn olive had done all of that for free, while also fixing nitrogen, feeding wildlife, and producing berries. But it was illegal now, so they destroyed it. My father refused. He kept his black locust alleys, kept the autumn olive on the back 40, kept managing them the way his father had taught him. When the county inspector came around, my father showed him the soil tests, the productivity records, the documentation going back 50 years. The inspector didn't fine him, but he made it clear that if any of those plants spread to neighboring properties, there would be consequences. We were allowed to keep what we had, but we couldn't plant more, couldn't propagate, couldn't share. The numbers they didn't want you seeing were still out there if you knew where to look. I spent months in university libraries in the 1990s, digging through agricultural journals and soil science publications, finding the data that never made it into the extension bulletins anymore. The science hadn't changed. The plants still worked exactly the way they always had, but somehow that information had stopped flowing to the people who needed it most. A 1988 study from the University of Illinois measured nitrogen fixation rates in black locust stands at 175 pounds per acre annually. That same study calculated the fertilizer equivalent value at $87 per acre per year using 1988 prices. Today, with nitrogen fertilizer costs what they are, that's worth over $200 per acre. The study also measured biomass production. Black locust produces 4 to 8 tons of woody growth per acre per year, all of it usable for firewood, fence posts, or lumber. The trees were literally making money while they improved the soil. Another study from 1991 looked at autumn olive and Appalachian reclamation sites. Strip-mined land, completely destroyed, topsoil gone, nothing but clay and rock. They planted autumn olive and measured what happened. Within 3 years, the plants had fixed enough nitrogen to support grass growth. Within 7 years, the soil organic matter had increased from 0.4% to 3.2%. Within 10 years, those sites had more biodiversity than unmined forest nearby. The autumn olive had rebuilt soil from nothing, and it did it faster and cheaper than any industrial reclamation method available. I found a 1985 comparison study that measured conventional farming against nitrogen fixer integrated systems over a 20-year period. The conventional farms used synthetic fertilizer and showed steady soil organic matter decline, from an average of 4.1% down to 2.3%. The integrated farms using black locust alleys and clover cover crops maintained soil organic matter above 4% for the entire study period. The yields were identical. The input costs weren't even close. The conventional farm spent an average of $180 per acre annually on nitrogen, while the integrated farms spent nothing. There were economic analyses, too. A 1989 report from the USDA Economic Research Service calculated that if 30% of American cropland incorporated nitrogen-fixing trees in alley cropping systems, it would reduce national fertilizer expenditure by $4.2 billion annually. That's $4.2 billion that would stay in farmers' pockets instead of going to chemical companies. The report was published in an obscure journal and never got picked up by agricultural media. I only found it because a retired USDA economist mentioned it at a conference. The data on soil health was even more dramatic. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer kills soil bacteria, including the rhizobia that fix nitrogen naturally. A 1992 soil biology study showed the fields under continuous synthetic fertilizer application for 20 years had 60% fewer beneficial bacteria than fields that had never been fertilized. The synthetic nitrogen was destroying the very organisms that could provide nitrogen for free. It was creating permanent dependency. I showed all this research to my father. We sat at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere, studies and reports and data that proved everything we'd been doing was right. He looked at it for a long time, then pushed it all aside. "Billy Joe," he said, "you think facts matter when there's billions of dollars on the other side? They'll bury this research, ignore it, or explain it away. They've already decided these plants are invasive. The science doesn't matter anymore." He was right. I tried sharing this information with neighbors, with extension agents, with anyone who'd listen. Most people didn't want to hear it. They'd already cut down their nitrogen-fixing trees. They'd already committed to the synthetic fertilizer system. Showing them the numbers just made them defensive. The farmers who remembered didn't disappear. They just went underground, stopped talking about what they were doing, stopped asking permission. I started meeting them at farmers' markets in the late 1990s, people who'd quietly kept their nitrogen-fixing plants, who'd propagated them in back corners of their property where inspectors wouldn't see, who'd maintained the knowledge their grandparents passed down even when the government said it was wrong. There was an old woman named Margaret Chen who sold vegetables at the Asheville market. Her tomatoes were legendary, massive and sweet, and she grew them without any fertilizer anyone could identify. I asked her about it one Saturday morning in 1998. She looked around to make sure nobody official was listening, then told me to come visit her farm. When I got there, I understood. She had black locust trees pruned into a specific shape, almost like a hedge, running between every crop row. "My grandfather brought these techniques from Guangdong," she said. "In China, they've been growing crops with nitrogen-fixing trees for 2,000 years. When Americans started calling these trees invasive, I just stopped mentioning them." Then there was Joel Martinez, who ran a permaculture operation in Southern Virginia. He had 40 acres designed around nitrogen fixers, black locust, honey locust, autumn olive, Siberian pea shrub, all integrated with vegetable production. He sold the produce at farmers' markets and the plants as soil amendments to people who understood what that meant. Technically legal, barely. He gave workshops on his property teaching people how to propagate and manage these species. "The knowledge is too valuable to let it die," he told me in 2003. "If the system wants to call this invasive, fine. I call it survival." The permaculture movement kept the information alive when mainstream agriculture abandoned it. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren published Permaculture 1 in 1978, and it treated nitrogen-fixing trees as fundamental infrastructure, not optional additions. Sepp Holzer in Austria was managing massive food forests where nitrogen fixers did all the fertility work. Masanobu Fukuoka in Japan had proven you could grow rice and barley without fertilizer by integrating nitrogen-fixing clover. These weren't fringe experiments. These were working farms producing commercial quantities of food, using techniques that American agriculture had declared obsolete. By 2010, regenerative agriculture was becoming a movement. Farmers who destroyed their soil with chemicals were looking for ways to rebuild it, and they were rediscovering nitrogen-fixing plants. The plants weren't legal to sell in most states, so people traded them. Cuttings changed hands at conferences. Seeds moved through informal networks. I watched black locust seedlings get passed around at a sustainable agriculture meeting in Kentucky. with everyone pretending they were something else. The scientific establishment started coming back around too. A 2015 study from the Rodale Institute showed that farms transitioning from synthetic to organic methods recovered soil health twice as fast when they incorporated nitrogen-fixing trees. A 2018 analysis from the University of California calculated that alley cropping with nitrogen fixers reduced fertilizer needs by 60 to 90% while maintaining yields. These were major universities publishing what my grandfather had known in 1950. I started teaching workshops on my own farm in 2012. I couldn't sell the plants, but I could teach people how to identify them, how to manage them, how to integrate them into existing operations. People came from 6 states to learn techniques that used to be common knowledge. They took notes like I was sharing classified information. In a way, I was. This was knowledge that the industrial system had tried to erase, and we were bringing it back one farmer at a time, one garden at a time, one person willing to remember at a time. What's waiting in the soil is the same thing that's always been there. The bacteria that fix nitrogen didn't go extinct when we banned the plants they partner with. The knowledge didn't become false when extension offices stopped teaching it. The black locust trees on my property are still doing exactly what they did for my grandfather and his father before him. They're still pulling nitrogen from the air, still building soil, still growing lumber that will outlast steel. Nothing about the biology changed, only our willingness to acknowledge it. I'm 60 years old now, and I've watched this pattern repeat with dozens of plants and practices. Something works too well without requiring purchased inputs, so the system finds a way to discredit it, ban it, or erase it from institutional memory. They did it with nitrogen-fixing plants. They did it with seed saving. They did it with heritage livestock breeds that forage instead of requiring commercial feed. They did it with every technique that creates independence instead of dependency. But here's what they can't do. They can't make the plant stop working. They can't rewrite biology. They can't change the fact that legumes form partnerships with rhizobia bacteria and fix atmospheric nitrogen into forms that feed other plants. They can't alter the reality that black locust produces more nitrogen per acre than most farmers apply synthetically. The science is still true. The plants are still alive. The knowledge is still accessible to anyone willing to look for it. My father died in 2005, and before he passed, he made me promise something. "Don't let them erase what we know," he said. "Don't let them convince you that 5 generations of experience is worth less than a corporate bulletin." I've kept that promise. I've kept the black locust alleys. I've kept the autumn olive on the back 40. I've kept the notebooks my grandfather filled with soil tests and yield records. And I've shared it all with anyone who asks, anyone who's willing to remember that agriculture worked before it became an industry. The young farmers coming up now are hungry for this information. They're tired of the chemical treadmill, tired of watching their soil degrade, tired of spending money on inputs that create more problems than they solve. They come to my farm and see 70-year-old black locust trees producing nitrogen and lumber simultaneously. They see soil that's never had synthetic fertilizer and grows better crops than their chemically dependent fields. They see a system that works with nature instead of fighting it, and they want to know how to build that on their own land. I tell them the same thing my grandfather told me: start small. Plant a few nitrogen-fixing trees or shrubs where they won't attract attention. Watch what happens to your soil. Measure it. Document it. Keep records like your grandfather's life depends on it, because your grandchildren's lives might. The system will tell you these plants are invasive, that you're being irresponsible, that modern agriculture has better solutions. Ignore them. Trust what works. Trust what's worked for thousands of years. The knowledge is waiting in the soil, waiting in the old bulletin stacked in my barn, waiting in the memory of every farmer who refused to forget. It's waiting for you to pick it up and use it. Subscribe to this channel because I'm going to keep telling these stories. I'm going to keep sharing what they tried to erase. Every plant they banned, every technique they buried, every piece of wisdom they replaced with products, it's all still here. We just have to remember it. The nitrogen is still in the air, the bacteria are still in the soil, the plants are still ready to work. All we have to do